Welcome, everyone. My name is Elin Vasquez. I'm the academic director here at Colegio Internacional Terranova. Dear students, teachers, distinguished guests, and members of our educational community, it is a true honor to welcome you to Dialogues of Knowledge, a space where reflection, idea exchange, and critical thinking converge to give us the opportunity to grow both as individuals and as a community. Today, as we gather here at Colegio Internacional Terranova, we are not only participating in an academic event, but also in a deep learning process that invites you and us to question, analyze, and above all, to have a better understanding the world around us. The event is built around three fundamental knowledge questions. The explorations of which question requires not only our intellectual skills, but also the values and abilities that define us as a member of the International Baccalaureate community. Through this experience, we aim to develop key attributes of our IB learner profile, such as being thinkers, inquirers, and communicators, which will allow us not just to provide answers, but also to question and explore diverse perspectives in a critical and respectful manner. First, critical thinking is at the heart of this event. As thinkers, we face the challenge of analyzing information objectively, but also of questioning and evaluating it. In each intervention, in every reflection, we must be able to challenge our own beliefs, examine ideas from different angles, and make thinking is not just about finding quick answers, but about being open to embracing complexity and ambiguity, characteristics inherent in a real world. Furthermore, the inquiry attribute plays a fundamental role in this process. Being an inquirer is not just an academic skill, it is a way of approaching the world. It involves being curious, formulating relevant questions, and seeking evidence to support our opinions. But most importantly, as inquirers, we must be rigorous in our search, reflective when analyzing information, and ethical when sharing our conclusions. Today, each one of you has the opportunity to demonstrate these research skills, not only by presenting your arguments, but also by listening to, integrating, and analyzing the ideas of others. Lastly, I would like to highlight the communicator attribute. Dialogue is not just an exchange of words, but also an opportunity to show respect for different opinions, while clearly and coherently expressing our own ideas. Here, effective communication means not only speaking, but also knowing how to listen, understand, and reflect before responding. In dialogues of knowledge, each of us has the responsibility to foster an environment of respectful conversation where ideas can flow freely and where we can learn from one another. As we address the three questions that will guide us throughout this event, I invite you to use all of these skills. Critical thinking to unravel the complexity of the topics, research to support our arguments, and effective communication to generate a space of respect and mutual understanding. This is an ideal moment to practice what it means to have an open mind, but also the courage to question what is established and seek new perspectives. Finally, I would like to remind you that this event is not only about finding definitive answers, but about enriching our ability to think more deeply, inclusively, and critically. Here, every idea and every reflection matters, and by sharing them, we all benefit from the process. I thank each of you for being here and for contributing with your enthusiasm and commitment. I am sure that Dialogues of Knowledge will be a space for growth and enrichment for all of us. May every intervention and discussion become an opportunity for learning and expanding our view of the world. I wish you all an intellectually stimulating, mutually respectful, and discovery-filled days. Now, I will introduce our special guest. Her name is Emilia Marmolejo. Okay, give me just 1 second here. So, Emilia Marmolejo Lopez is an anthropologist. Uh, she is an IB graduate and, up until recently, an individual science societies teacher and for the Middle Years program here at Colegio Terranova. Welcome, Emilia. Very nice to see you again. And uh, let the dialogues begin. Thank you. Bye bye, everyone.
Thank you, Eileen. Wonderful introduction. Thank you. Have a nice day. Okay, good morning. Well, Eileen already said my name. I am deeply honored to be here today, this morning, and host this discussion where we will explore the question, what are the challenges that indigenous knowledge is facing in a globalized world? I don't see anybody here. I don't know if I should just start. Should I wait for somebody? Okay. To introduce this topic, I would like to say that in territories, oh, okay, here we are. Hi. Oh, some familiar faces. Good morning. So we have here 5 students from different schools. I see your names: Samuel, Santiago, Ivan, Raina. Is that how it's pronounced? No, you told me in a minute then. And Charlie. Okay, so this morning we'll be discussing the challenges that indigenous knowledge is facing in a globalized world. I would like to introduce this topic by saying that in territories that are deeply shaped by colonization, its impact expands to the languages we speak and the beliefs that we hold, both individually and collectively. This makes it imperative for us to engage in intercultural dialogues on the value of indigenous knowledge. In both Mexico and the United States, colonization is often ignored or framed as a thing of the past, despite its ongoing effects. While globalization promises a more connected and inclusive world, it has also jeopardized cultural diversity and reinforced power imbalances between nations and communities. It has been primarily indigenous thinkers and activists who have challenged the notion that globalization is universally beneficial. Today, as we hold this discussion table, IB schools from different schools, cultures, and experiences, you will share your perspectives on the challenges that indigenous knowledge is facing. Before we start, I just want to ask you for your contribution in making this a safe, inclusive, and respectful space. We're all here to learn and share. I remind you that this session will last an hour, and each participation is limited to 90 seconds to ensure that all of you get a chance to participate. So starting with the question of what do we understand as indigenous, I would ask you, if you want to answer, just present yourselves how you would like to be called, and then tell us what you think. I can also call you on. What do we understand as indigenous? What do we call indigenous? Is it the best descriptor? Are we just going to stare at each other this morning? Okay, let's try this another way. Do we have an example of indigenous knowledge? Anybody can give us an example? Yeah, Ivan, go ahead.
I will give us an example of indigenous knowledge. Many of the Mexican cultures, like their traditions, all their agricultural techniques, as well as their language. I think those are pretty good examples of what indigenous knowledge can abort.
Yeah, thank you, Ivan. And you're representing with which school?
I'm representing Terranova.
Great, thank you. Yes, just as Ivan said, in Mexico we have over 350 different variations of indigenous languages. Anybody else? Another example? Yes, go ahead. Could you please say your name and the school you're representing?
Okay. Hi, my name's Reina Bigay. I'm with NAFO Prep in New Mexico. And when looking at indigenous knowledge, or like the word indigenous, I see it as a way of fully expressing different cultures. For me, coming from the Navajo culture, the federally recognized tribe, Native American tribe, I see it as a way of expressing ourselves without it being sort of too derogative, sort of. But indigenous is a way of us representing ourselves in a way, you know?
Thank you. Can you please repeat how your name is pronounced? I don't want to keep on mispronouncing it.
It's okay. It's Reina.
Reina. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Reina. Anybody else wants to contribute to this? Ask a question, maybe. Yeah, Santiago, your name and.
Yeah, my name is Santiago. I come from Terranova, and I think indigenous refers to like I don't know, to like something native, like from a place, or something original from a region or country. But I think here in Mexico we refer to indigenous like to something more, like linked to ancient cultures that were least or well, have least connection to like like Spanish culture, like since the conquista, since the like when the Spanish arrived. So like I think we here call indigenous to something more like ancient, or something more traditional. Well, not traditional. I would say something more um, I don't know, kind of from like unlinked to Spanish culture.
Thank you, Santiago. Do we have a response? Okay. Are indigenous cultures always linked to ancient cultures? Okay, let's try this another way. We call very different cultures indigenous, right? We have indigenous cultures all the way from Canada to the south of whether depending on where you are, the continent or the continents in America, right? And all these cultures we call indigenous. What do they have in common? Samuel?
My name is Samuel. I'm from Gimnasio del Norte on Colombia. And I think that a common interpretation of indigenous cultures is that they have rooted their knowledge and their culture and their, of course, way of living off of nature and the environment that surrounds them. So I think it is mostly influenced by how they perceive it. The way that they perceive the world is mostly influenced by the phenomenon that they can see around each other and how they connect with nature through like harvest seasons or floods and droughts and many of the hardships that the environment presents these communities.
Thank you, Samuel. Okay. When we began this discussion, Raina told us that indigenous was also a way of representing themselves, right? I don't know, Raina, would you agree with this idea that something that is common of indigenous cultures is this root in nature and this relationship with the environment? Is that something that you feel is true, that's your experience?
Yeah, I agree with it that there is different cultures that do have a connection in a way with nature. But one thing that I've noticed too, the connection within different cultures is different stories that they share. For an example, in the Navajo culture, we have different a creation story, like different stories that go with certain seasons. And when looking at other cultures, their stories are similar in a way, but also different but they're similar with their theme that they're trying to get across, or like the lesson that they want to get to the children or people. And that's something that I've seen that is similar within cultures itself, is the stories that they share, or like the lessons that come out of those stories. And I do agree with the similarity of like harvesting and being connected with nature, because there are different cultures that have different ways of making a basket, or different ways of making a blanket and stuff like that using their surroundings.
Thank you. Anybody else? Do you have a question, contribution before we move on? Okay. How does indigenous knowledge then differ from Western, or what we maybe would call scientific knowledge? Is it different? In which ways? Charlie, go ahead.
Sorry. Mute yourself. So, like Raina was saying, the Navajo creation story differ from like the Western view of like scientific and evolution and stuff. As for the Navajos, they came like there's some of their stories is that they've emerged from different worlds, and they're on their fourth world now. So these things and like the lessons they've learned from like their way of getting to where we are now is way different from like the Western view of like evolution and how we are. Yeah.
Thank you. Does anybody want to respond, contribute, expand on this idea? Yeah, Santiago?
Well, I think this Western or scientific knowledge we are referring to, it's has more of a method or well, kind of a procedure to get to it or to prove something about it or something related to that. And it has like more step to step, and you have to measure something or you have to analyze some data. And I think indigenous knowledge is more linked to qualitative like focus, or is more, I don't know, I think it's less measurable and more about how we see it, or how we, I don't know, how it has been passed down, passed through like different generations.
Thank you. Do you all agree? Is indigenous knowledge less about what we can measure and the method of how it's obtained than scientific Western knowledge? I would do it like this. Is there no method to indigenous knowledge? Yeah, Samuel.
Well, I think it's the indigenous method of knowledge is still based on observation of their surroundings. Like even though it can be different from Western world, I think that they still have like very important findings in medicine, and which they have achieved through experimentation and seeing how the environment is able to like connect with itself. And mm, yeah, so basically observation is still being a key point in the creation of indigenous knowledge.
Thank you, Samuel. Anybody else? Yeah, Ivan?
I don't really agree with Santi on its differences of indigenous knowledge and Western, because there are some indigenous knowledge that has been a base of many measuring methods. For example, if I'm right, I believe that the Mayan culture was the one who first developed the use of the number zero. So it's a really important number in the maths, and it helps to measure different things. And as well as many another Mexican cultures developed one of the first calendars in the indigenous knowledge.
Thank you, Ivan. Anybody else? Yeah, Reina, go ahead.
I somewhat agree and disagree with their statements because in the Navajo culture, we do have sort of like methods of learning of where it's just testing and then we learn from it. But we also have those who are knowledgeable in how much to use, like Western knowledge, measuring, and how much can go into it. But with looking at it overall, like from indigenous cultures, from what I hear mostly from different stories or like what others have shared, it is that their medicine men or sort of like their doctors in their culture have learned through tests and trials of which medicine to take and which one can help with certain like dosage of certain body aches sort of, and that's where it connects to Western cultures, but it differs because when looking at the Western ideology of like how something or how knowledge can be gained, sort of, it differs because of how, like I said, like they test it, but they don't, sort of. It's hard to explain.
Do you mean that it's also like knowledge that has been built for generations, and so you already know it works?
Yeah, it's sort of like that.
Okay, right. Anybody else? A question? Yeah, Samuel?
It is not really a question, but like a proposal that not all indigenous people are uh, indigenous knowledge is built off of like observation through generations. I think that a very important example of this is the Pirajas, which is an indigenous community placed in the Amazon rainforest inside Brazil. And one of their key aspects is that their way of perceiving life is off of the immediacy of their perspective. If something is in front of them or it's not, if something can be heard or can no longer be heard, is a key aspect in their culture. And they base most of their cultural experiences as a community, because they're still very connected as a community, through conversation of their day-to-day life. However, they do not rely at all on testimonies that are far away in the past. Like, for example, they do not take testimonies off of people that maybe are already dead, because of their way of interpreting the immediacy. That's also another reason why they really don't have a key differentiation between dreams and reality, and they interpreted them as both valid experiences.
Thank you, Samuel. Does anybody want to reply to that? I appreciate this contribution because I think so far we've also have had this difficulty to distinguish like ancient knowledge and ancient indigenous knowledge, like we're talking about like 500 years or over 500 years, to what is contemporary indigenous knowledge, right? And sometimes like we can get caught on some stereotypes or ideas that we have on how all maybe indigenous cultures are. And that's why at the beginning I was asking, what do they actually have in common if we're talking about cultures that are so different from each other? Like you talked about the pirajas, if I'm yeah, that's the culture. Yeah. And they are obviously different from the Navajo nation. So what would the pirajas and the Navajos have in common? Why do we call both of them indigenous? That's the question. Reina, sorry. Oh, no? Oh, yeah. Okay, then go ahead.
I forgot who said this earlier, but
Mhm.
referring to the term indigenous, I forgot who said it, but it was how of like using the word indigenous. I think it of like re-perspecting it, sort of looking at it from a different perspective, is that it's sort of referring to the person who's like originally from there, and that's how most people use it today, sort of. Where like for me or like a couple students from here say I'm indigenously from this place, sort of. Like I think of it as you referring from you originally relate, like sort of from that place for a tribe.
Thank you. Okay, so for instance, somebody who's not indigenous, not from an indigenous culture, such as myself. I am originally from Guadalajara, but I would not say I am indigenous from Guadalajara. Why? Yeah, Charlie?
Sorry. I'm the same way. Like technically, I'm French and I come from the French people, but I grew up in the United States and I don't know anything about that culture or anything, so I don't associate with my culture because my family isn't a part of it. But if you look at like lineage, I am. And that's kind of, especially in the United States, I feel that is how globalization has kind of destroyed cultures, in the way that like they just get rid of, like I don't know how to explain that, but just like through years of not like being in touch with your own culture, it like just gets washed away.
Thank you, Charlie. That's a great way to smooth ourselves to the next part of this discussion on how has globalization affected indigenous knowledge. Anybody else wants to contribute to what Charlie says, or maybe talk more about these challenges? What else have you observed?
I can add on to what Charlie said. One thing that we do face in Navajo culture, or basically every culture sort of in the United States, is the loss of language, especially in younger generations. Here at the school, they are trying their best on encouraging students to utilize Navajo language more. But with looking at different cultures, that is one thing that is common amongst them, is the younger generation not really utilizing their language or completely understanding it. And with the language, it also comes with their culture. There is a disconnection from the younger generation and the older generation, sort of, where the older generation understands more than the younger due to globalization, especially. And one thing that I've noticed that is hard, or globalization can help with, especially in language learning, is creating accessibility for it, because this is what the school is doing, having it accessible for students to learn easier, for it to have it be a class. Whereas when you look at schools on different reservations, however, most of them don't have the option or the accessibility to do that. So that's one thing that I'm grateful for the school does have to offer to us, is the language class of Navajo.
Thank you, Reina. This sort of efforts to, what would you call it, like repair. You know, there's like this data that every 3 months, one language of the world disappears. Why would a language disappear? And why is it mostly indigenous languages, the ones that are at risk? Is it just globalization? Yeah, Santiago?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with like opportunities, because, for example, if you are here in Mexico and you only speak, I don't know, Nahuatl, maybe when you go like to a city or, I don't know, a town, and you're trying to find, I don't know, a job or something, or only trying to communicate to people. I think it's well, if most of people don't speak that dialect, that language, I think it's gonna be really hard for you to, I don't know, get a job, like meet more people, and so on. So I think people are forced to learn like the common language of a region, and like be slowly forgetting their own, like the original language, because it's easier to live like in a world where, well, not in a world, but like it's easier to get like, I don't know, more opportunities if you just like start to lose this language that it's not really common, or like that it's kind of extinguishing, in order to, I don't know, to get to like, sorry, to get more opportunities, or and associate with like the people that speak the most common language, you know.
Thank you, Santiago. Do you, yeah, Charlie?
Tying back to both what like Santi and Reina have said, um, even within like groups of indigenous cultures, there are some languages within them that are like less known than others. Like even though Navajo is kind of a dying language, it is still the most commonly, like one of the most commonly spoke languages within the Native Americans. Like our school, we have like our Navajo prep, we have Navajo language, and this year we actually got Navajo to be an IB class. Um, and but there are other like cultures within like Native Americans kind of that kind of all just get grouped together, but they're not, they're separate. Like the Cree people, their language is dying as well, and it's way less known. There isn't a school that teaches the language like there is for Navajo. Along with like other mistranslations of these indigenous languages, like for example, the Navajo language is actually on Duolingo, but it's not really correct. A lot of it is mistranslated, and yeah.
Thank you, Charlie. So what is behind all of this? What's behind, Santiago used the word like extinguishing. Why are some languages dying while others are becoming, yeah, more common? Why are we all speaking English in here? Yeah, Ivan?
I would like to use some information that I found on the Mexican Center of Research and Higher Studies in social anthropology. That it says that the principal reasons why indigenous languages, at least here in Mexico, are dying, are the migration, because in order for many indigenous communities or communities here in Mexico are in the need of migrating to the United States. And in order to do that, they need, at least they need to learn Spanish so they can communicate with other people that is migrating there. And then as well as English in order to acquire a job there. It also says that one of the causes is economical and ideological factors. I could say, I think that here in Mexico, with the arrival of Spain hundreds of years ago, most of the country adopted the religion of that they brought from Europe, and it's a religion that doesn't really gets along with all the indigenous knowledge these communities had before, so they are forced to quit their religion and join the ones they bring, as well as their language in order to learn of the new religion they were forced to learn.
Thank you, Ivan. Anybody would like to contribute? Yeah, Reina?
Going off base of like what everyone's saying, it is true that, especially what Charlie said with the Duolingo, that there is some mistranslations within the Navajo language, but I also think it has to be due to sort of trauma that a few elders have gained throughout history. Because when you look at, especially toward the Navajos, the government, or the U.S. in general, the government tried to stop many cultures from practicing many of their stories, many of their dances, to stop that indigenous way of thinking. And when looking at like different elders and talking to them and asking them why, or talking to the younger generation as to why they're not learning their culture, sort of, it's mostly the response is because no one taught me. And when you go to like elders who do have that knowledge to pass it on, most of them share that it is due to the trauma that they experience. And with the Navajos, they experienced in the Navajo Long Walk. And that was something that was very traumatic for our people, because when looking back, they were treated in harsh conditions, but yet we're still thriving today because many want to prove those who were opposed us wrong. And it's due to the fact that elders do have that knowledge and accessibility to teach the younger generation. However, it's due to the trauma that they gained along the way, or of that thought of having the thought of like them being punished for practicing what they believe in, sort of.
Thank you, Reina. I'm sorry. So I think Ivan and Reina have now given us some common ground, right? Like he talked about migration and economical hardship, for instance, that makes people move and therefore learn a different language. And then Reina talked about how like Navajo cultures and other indigenous cultures in the US, but I think it's also common to Mexico and other Latin American countries, where people have been forced to abandon their language and their traditions, for example. So would you agree that, for instance, a language disappears because it is discriminated against? Or is there another reason why languages disappear or cultures disappear? Yeah, someone?
Well, I think that, of course, in the early stages of especially Latin American colonization history, it was due to the indoctrination of indigenous people into the Catholic religion, which was only allowed to be practiced through Spanish and not through any other languages. So it definitely forced many indigenous people to forget their languages. But also in more modern times, the process of economic globalization around indigenous areas has forced them to abandon their language characteristics. For example, as they are forced to trade with other outsiders because they have seized their hunting grounds and they need other means of getting their supplies or food, they have slowly forgotten these languages. However, I think that some cultures have somehow prevailed to this globalization. I think that an example of this is on the northeastern side of Colombia. There is the Wayu language, which is um, actually, I would say, it is even more used than Spanish, and it forces the like any traders and outsiders, foreigners, maybe tourists that want to visit there to use that language in order to communicate with these communities, which which are only able to speak this language. Although there are still like other languages like the Tinigua, the Anuyu, like the Carijona that have completely perished to this globalization process. There are still hopes of preserving the languages that these communities still have.
Thank you, Samuel. Does anybody want to reply? Yeah, Santiago?
Well, I think well, part of what you've been saying, I think I don't know, but I think the question, I don't know how to say, but I think we are blaming a lot of like this dying cultures, indigenous cultures, and globalization. I think it's important to say that globalization actually can improve the spread of indigenous knowledge around the world, but I think we are misusing it. It's like sometimes, for example, here in San Luis Potosi, there is this Huastecan culture. Well, this kind of, I don't think it's ritual. I think festivity named Shantolo. I think in the past years it has been more known because they have, I mean, this kind of globalization culture. I don't know, through media and through I don't know, this easier way of transporting things from the Western culture, help help the people get to know more about that culture, that indigenous culture. But I think this is not very used. Like this is practices of getting indigenous knowledge to to people, like so they know it. I don't think it's very used because I don't know. I think there are more. Oh, I don't know, but I think globalization really is a tool that can help us stop these challenges indigenous knowledge is facing, but as mostly it's not very common to use it like to help the spread of this digital knowledge, or sometimes it can be misused. Uh,
Thank you, Santiago. Do you maybe have an example of how it can be misused?
well, yeah. For example, I don't know, textile industries. I'm gonna use the same example of the Huastecan culture. There are some, I don't know, textile, like some clothing. sorry, the Aztecan culture use, like their designs and colors they use. They symbolize, I don't know, sometimes connection to land or connection to this spiritual part. But I don't know, companies like Sara or Patrol, they take this designs for this traditional clothing the indigenous people make and just sell it without like I don't know telling people what they actually mean. Like just they sell them just for the sake of saying, oh well, this we are using some indigenous cultural items without like yeah really getting into what they mean and losing this this knowledge about what this fabrics or this designs how they have an impact on the indigenous culture.
Thank you,
So
Santiago. Yeah, I think we got your point. Thank you. Anybody wants to reply to Santiago? I would like to say that now I think you've listed at least 3 challenges, right? Charlie earlier said something about like how cultures have like the loss of diversity, for example. Santiago just mentioned 2, or 1, the commodification of indigenous knowledge or cultural appropriation of those. Are there any others you would like to mention? Yeah, Ivan.
I think that there's also the undervaluation of the products that indigenous knowledge creates. I wanna give a, for example, Loro Piana. Loro Piana is an Italian brand of a high luxury class that provides to their to their buyers high quality clothes made from natural fabrics, principally mainly from Peru. However, according to an article from the newspaper Gestion, published the last year, the brand has all these vicuña sweaters that it's material from special llamas there. They have sold it for nearly $9,000. However, the Peruvian communities that provide these animals fibers only receive around $280. So here the brand is appropriating and undervaluing the work from the indigenous knowledge that these Peruvians have on how to manipulate and work with the vicuñas fiber in order to create clothes, and they're using it to take a greater like payment or a bigger goods from them, and they're not evaluating on the fair way the work that these Peruvians give.
Thank you, Ivan. Reina, I believe you were gonna say something earlier. Do you wanna go ahead? No? Okay. Samuel earlier. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, well, I think that um, although we sometimes value maybe medicinal knowledge that some cultures have of the environment that surrounds us, for example, there are some Amazonic tribes that have found a specific combination of a family of fruits that allows for to create a numbness that alleviates pain. And I apologize, I don't have the name of the culture, but um, the researchers said that if they were to slowly experiment with the those family roots over and over again, like trying to find the right combination, it would take longer than even the human race has existed. So they have a very special knowledge in how these herbs are able to correlate with each other and create um, yeah, a very potent medicine. But I still think that maybe we take those knowledges and maybe ignore how they their philosophy and how they understand the world. If we take it back to the like pirajas, their immediacy of perspective doesn't allow them to understand arithmetic. Like numbers are such an abstract concept that they cannot be able to count to 10. So it might seem as a disadvantage, but I still think that we as Western culture are able to benefit from this because have you thought about maybe how anxious people get when thinking about the future or how depressed people get thinking about the past when if they were able to live in the immediacy of their perspectives they could maybe be happier and be able to enjoy off of each other's stories and yeah experiences how the Pira has do. That's just yeah maybe something I wanted to propose.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it was Santiago first who said, globalization isn't all bad. We can, learn from indigenous communities and their knowledge, and it can benefit us all. I would just then question you, what would be the difference between globalization and colonization? Is there a difference? Like if we're looking at indigenous knowledge as something that can benefit all of us, which is true, how do we do it in a way that it's not cultural appropriation? And can we talk about globalization without thinking of colonization?
Do I answer?
If you wish, yeah,
Oh
go
yeah,
ahead.
of course. So I think that the difference between colonization and globalization is how globalization can be used to benefit both parties, while colonization is only a one way side which benefits from a culture and just decides to impose over their own. So maybe as a globalized world, we can understand these differences in philosophic and existential way of viewing the world, and maybe being able to consolidate it with our own beliefs and validating it, such as that we understand how each culture with its own knowledge of the world is still beneficial to us.
Thank you, Samuel. Anybody wants to reply? Okay, we have a question from the audience. I believe it was a professor from a school, Carlos, who asks this. If the notion of identity is tied to the notion of territory, how can indigenous knowledge be impacted by environmental degradation or dispossession? Moving to another challenge of globalization, environmental degradation. Yeah, go ahead, Samuel.
Well, I
Oh, Santiago, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
I think this is tied with what Ivan said about migration, because if a territory or like the place where I don't know, an indigenous community was being degraded or was facing some like challenges or was being, I don't know, is dying, like people are gonna have to move, they're gonna have to migrate to another zone where they can establish themselves in order to survive. So this may, well, maybe a problem because I don't know. For example, if they move to a city or some urbanized place, well, there could be this challenge of the language, for example. I don't know. So here it's like this is linked with the challenge of migration and like moving on to a place because of the circumstances.
Thank you, Santiago. Anybody else wants to give it a go? Yeah, Reina?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Sure. If the notion of indigeneity, sorry, this is a difficult word to pronounce, indigeneity is tied to the notion of territory, how can indigenous knowledge be impacted by environmental degradation or disposition?
Okay, sorry. With looking at the question, I think indigenous knowledge can be impacted by environmental degradation because with different cultures of tying back to like our last conversation of how they're connected to nature sort of, it could lose the knowledge that they currently have in that one plant or that one mineral that they had access to. But now with that being gone or it being destroyed, that's something that the language or the culture or that knowledge that they had to medicine or stories or something connected to their culture could disappear because they don't have that access to it. But that's also where the idea of storytelling comes into play because they could tell the story of how they use that plant. However, they can't show coming generations of how to use it and tie it back, sort of. And it's just a way of them losing that knowledge overall because they don't have that accessibility to it anymore because of it being gone or of it being taken away from them.
Thank you, Reina. So our time is about to end. Before we go, I would like to ask you, which of these challenges that we have discussed about today would you say is the most important, the most challenging facing indigenous knowledge? Yeah, Ivan?
I will say that it's the appropriation of this knowledge, given that maybe it's not as visible as the extinction of it could be, but it's more of a something's invisible challenge that the indigenous knowledge is facing. For example, with the environmental degradation, it can also be caused by the appropriation of the globalized world. I don't know, for example, I want to use the agricultural practices from indigenous communities, specifically in the Andes, where they use traditional practices like terrace farming, where they plant their seeds and their like potatoes or quinoa on the risks of the mountains, so they have more diverse biodiversity of these products. But industries that wants to grow in a global level require a faster and more effective process for a production rate. So used they have replaced these techniques that have been built with an indigenous knowledge around many generations. They have changed it to monocultural crops that are more intended for global markets. Or with the language, how not only people from, I don't know, Mexico or other Latin American countries migrate to the United States, but also people from the Europe or United States migrate to these Latin American countries and appropriate of their economic and their language by making, I don't know, the stores or the stores to grow their prices so they can take more advantage of them. And as well with the textile and the clothes, how they use this natural process techniques for their products, and they give it in a higher price, evaluating the work produced by this indigenous knowledge, and they are appropriating it.
Thank you, Van. Anybody else wants to answer that question quickly before we go? Yeah, Charlie?
I think a really important aspect of indigenous cultures is their land. And I know that a lot of indigenous cultures are connected to their land in more than just physical ways, through crops and things, but also in spiritual ways. Like the Navajo culture, there are the sacred mountains, and there's places that through their culture they've emerged from, and they hold high significance to. And it's not just the Navajos. I know this about the Iroquois the Iroquois, and I feel indigenous people having a connection to their land without it being turned through globalization, through either deforestation or drillings and things, is a really important factor. Yeah.
Thank you. Maybe one last contribution before we go. Yeah, Samuel, go ahead.
I think that the main challenge that indigenous knowledge faces is the industrialized and globalized enterprises that are harming their environment. Like for example, the Brazilian wood industry chopping off millions of acres um, off of the Amazon rainforest, and oil industries and illegal mining industries polluting the rivers and destroying where the indigenous people live and get their food from. So if the indigenous people are getting their knowledge off of the land and of the environment that surrounds us, what knowledge will be left if there's no environment to take knowledge from?
Thank you, Samuel. Okay. Well, I have to let you go, even though this is beginning to be very interesting. Well, continuing to be very interesting. Today we talked about what it is to be indigenous, what are the main challenges that globalization brings, and its link to colonization. And lastly, you all made a lot of emphasis on environmental challenges and climate change and how it will impact mostly indigenous communities and their language. So I thank you all for being here today and for sharing your knowledge, for asking questions, and for making us all think this morning of February. I hope you have a wonderful day, and hope to see you again next year in these important dialogues that Terra Nova organizes. See you.
Bye, thanks.
Bye, thank you.
Thanks.
Bye, thank you.